Hello my friends, and I'm Dakian, and this is my first look video for the new supplement for Malifaux called Shifting Loyalties. Now, this is a big, thick book that, well, the cost varies depending on where you find it. But the format should be familiar to you if you have the second edition rulebook and or Crossroads. It's a big full color book. It is a grand total of 280 some pages and contains a lot of different types of material. Now, it's billed as, at least in some circles, as being the campaign supplement, and this is partially true. It does contain the campaign rules. But if you look at the content pages, you will find that the specifically campaign-related rules are in the first 3 chapters, which go up to page 65. From page 66 onwards, it is all general material that you can use either in a campaign or in a pickup game or in a tournament or whatever. Specifically, from chapter 4 onwards, each chapter is for a faction, as you can see, and it follows the format from previous books that it has new stat cards for new models, most of which are not available yet, but some are. They include the new starter set, for example, and the Crossroads 7. And there's a lot of fiction, there's a lot of fluff. And the fluff kind of brings the story forward. It also explains the existence of some of the new models. And yeah, physically it's very, very nicely produced. There is only one slight issue, a sort of typo, which is in the 10 Thunders fiction. It seems they wanted to use some special characters, but it seems they forgot to check that the printer had the right fonts, because instead you get these little boxes, these little rectangles in many places. And I'm not quite sure what they're supposed to be. I think they're probably different characters in different places. And yeah, but that's a minor issue, though I think they should have caught it. Going onward, I think I will talk about the general material first, because that's quicker, and then come back to the campaign rules. So, the general rules, well, the fluff is what you would expect. I mean, the stories, if you like the fiction that they've written in the past, you're going to like this stuff. It's in the same vein. No issue, there isn't really a lot to comment about there. When it comes to the new miniatures, of course, they're continuing their tradition of publishing stats for minis way, way before they actually produce the miniatures themselves. I mean, there's some stats cards in the basic rulebook that they haven't produced new plastic minis for yet. You know. And these characters are mostly from the fluff or from new stuff. The main new thing is the emissaries. And to talk about the emissaries, I have to talk a little bit about the campaign rules at the same time, because the emissaries are essentially powered up effigies. They're really big models. They're all on 50mm basis that sort of represent the essence of their faction. And they are intended to replace avatars. Now, if you never played first edition Malifaux, you might not know what an avatar is. There was the possibility in that edition of a master of a crew transforming into a more powerful shape, an avatar, essentially, like, again, channeling a lot of his faction's power. There were a lot of issues with that, and I'm not going to go into that a lot, because if you played back then, you know the issues, and if you didn't, then they don't matter to you. But let's just say that they have solved the issue of both the problems they had back then and the problem of backward compatibility by still having rules for avatars, but they are restricted to campaign play. And this is to balance them out. All the avatars are straight up upgrades. They're all just plain improvements on your normal master, but you have to get them by buying them with the campaign currency. And yeah, so you don't need to play them in normal games. In normal games, instead, if you want a super powerful creature, you take the emissary. I said I wasn't going to go into the issues. I'm not going to go into the rules issues, but the economic issues, production issues, we can talk a bit about. The problem there was that producing a avatar figure for each master was a drain on resources for Word, and it was very costly for players. So now instead they're going to produce one kit, one emissary for each faction. And the idea seems to be that you will use this for the emissary, and you can use it as a proxy for the avatars if you're playing with those in a campaign. Or if you still have the old metal avatar models, you can use them for avatars, and you can also use them as proxies for emissaries while we're waiting for the new plastic kits, which are not even on the release schedule yet. If you don't have the old metals and you want to play with emissaries, well, you're going to have to use some other proxies. Be creative. Anyway, the stat. I'm not one to sit and pore over stats and theorycraft and say, oh, this is OP or whatever. I'm gonna wait and see how it all shakes out in play. That's my usual take on it. So, let's move on to talk about the campaigns. So, campaigns, as I said, there's 3 chapters about campaigns, and they've very nicely divided up the rules in 3 sections. The first chapter is the must-have rules, the rules you have to use if you're playing a campaign. Second chapter is optional rules, things you can use to spice up the campaign or play variants. You can use them, I mean, your local group can tailor a campaign to fit their particular tastes, which is very nice of them. And finally, chapter 3 is avatars, which I suppose could be considered optional as well. Except they're in the basic rules, but, I mean, you can probably make anything optional. The basic idea of a campaign is you start out with a small number of models in what's known as your arsenal. Your arsenal is the pool of models and upgrades you have to choose from when putting together a crew for a game. And you start out not having a master. You start out with a henchman as your leader, and you have to buy a master later in the campaign. Again, right on one of the first few pages, they have variations. You can change the arsenal size you start with. You can start with a master. And you can even change the basic assumption that the campaign is played in weeks. They kind of assume that you have a gaming group that can get together and play games 1 or 2 times per week. But as they say, if your group plays less frequently, you can just say that a week is, you know, whenever you get together, whether that's bi-weekly or monthly or whatever, you know, as long as you all agree. A campaign also has a set end. They say that it can last for 4, 6, 8, or 12 weeks. And we will find in the optional rules that a campaign can be played just for fun, or it can be played to find a winner, depending on what you feel like. The thing that makes it a campaign, apart from, of course, the usual stuff about, you know, buying new models and buying upgrades for them, depending on how well you do in the game, and also the potential for injuries or even permanent death of some models. This is the stuff you have in all campaigns, campaign systems for miniature games. You flip the colorful things that happen here that are specific to Malifaux is the weekly events. You flip kind of like how you flip for strategies or schemes, except that you flip for an event that affects every game, what they call every encounter played that week, and there are quite a lot. I mean, you see there's a long list of possible events that can happen, and they can be very, very weird or interesting. And I'm not going to go into detail about them all, mostly because I can't remember them all. Anyway, you set up a game pretty much like a normal pickup game, except that the limit of soulstones you can pick from your arsenal is determined by the player who has the least models in their crew. You always calculate something called a campaign rating, which tells you how well you're doing in the campaign. And as they say, the campaign rating is used to help offset any unfair advantages. It's a balancing issue. The most immediate, obvious thing about it is that this player who has the lower campaign rating gets more soul stones into their pool. So they will be able to change results more often during the game. And as I said, there are rules for when a model dies or is injured in some permanent way. There's a rule for strategic withdrawal, which simply means you can decide, well, I've accomplished all my objectives this game, and I don't want to risk losing any more of my models, so I'm just going to withdraw. And then you basically just immediately end the game. But if you do that too soon, then you lose benefits. You lose victory points or the ability to make flips for equipment or that sort of thing. The aftermath is like the post-game phase, where you draw cards to... Well, first off, you get paid in something called scrip, which is what you use to buy new models and so forth. And you can also make a barter flip. I mean, there are some things you can always buy. I mean, new models from your faction, or normal upgrades, or some specific campaign upgrades can always be bought for a set cost. But there are also upgrades you can only get through random chance. And that's what these tables are for. And you flip for that between each game. And these things can be either skills or equipments, and this is kind of new. They are both sort of like upgrades, but work slightly differently to normal upgrades. A skill is an upgrade that is specific to a certain model, and that's, obvious from the name. If a certain character learns a new skill, you can't just transfer it to another model. That wouldn't make sense. Equipment, though, is, of course, gear, and you can just move that between your models freely. And some of these can be really, really powerful. Then you have reward flips for what's known as bounties, and this is another mechanic where you can sort of take on... It's sort of a long-term scheme. I mean, comparing it to a role-playing game, you might say it's a quest that you voluntarily take on, that you're going to accomplish certain objectives within the next game or few games. Many of them can only be accomplished after at least 2 games. Like, for example, this here, spare parts, end a game with 4 more scrap markers in play 2 times. So you have to play at least 2 games to be able to finish that bounty. And when you finish a bounty, you get to flip on, like I said, these specific reward tables that have really, really powerful stuff. There's injuries, which are sort of like skills in that they are applied to specific models, except they're bad. They're not good. And here's the thing. There's an interesting mechanic where when a model is taken out of the game, as in killed, as it would normally be called, you make a flip to see if it has to become injured or not. And anything which is 3 or higher means you have to flip for an injury after the game. But if you flip an ace or a 2, you get off, you get out of jail free. And here's the important part. This flip can be cheated. That means you have a reason to hold on to your really bad cards, your aces and 2s, if you're playing a campaign game, because you might want to use them to avoid injuries. And that's interesting because it limits, if you hold on to those cards, that limits the number of high value cards you have, so you can't cheat as much on other stuff. And then we get into the optional rules. And they have optional rules for just about everything. Everything from, playing without injuries completely to having unavoidable injuries, that there's no way to cheat or avoid injury at all if you get hit. And various other rules you can have if you're playing, as they say, a competitive campaign. And then, of course, the rules for the avatar. Now, all the campaign-specific cards have to be purchased separately. There's a box of cards. I have it somewhere around here. I forgot what it's called. It's obvious. It has sort of the shifting loyalties tag applied to it. And that has all the cards for the avatars, cards for all the skills and equipment, and other stuff you can get. It also has some errata cards, I think 2 or 3 stat cards for existing models that they've issued errata rules for. They have fixed cards with the new rules on them, which is nice. So, what's my impression of this? Well, I haven't actually played a campaign yet, but I understand that these rules have been pretty thoroughly play-tested. We're pretty good about that. And I essentially trust them to make things good. And I mean, the campaign can be what you want it to be because of all these optional rules. Essentially, you can make a campaign exactly the way you want it to be. And I like that. I think that sort of freedom is refreshing. And I'm looking forward. I'm going to try to convince my local group to start a campaign. And we'll see how it goes. And if you're any sort of Malifaux fan, you probably have this book already. I mean, I don't need to sell it to you. And I had a lot of fun reading it, and it ignited some even more interest in me for playing Malifaux. Well, that's just about all I can say about the game, I think. I mean, the supplement, the book. So, until next video, this is Doc Eon, signing off.